The Panther tank was Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, a machine designed to dominate any battlefield it entered. With its sloped armor, powerful 75mm gun, and reputation for invincibility in frontal engagements, Panther crews approached most encounters with quiet confidence. They had learned to respect enemy tanks that met them head-on, but they never expected to be outmaneuvered by what they considered inferior American machines. The M10 Wolverine changed everything about that assumption in ways that shattered German tactical doctrine. When German intelligence first reported on the M10 tank destroyer, the analysis was dismissive. On paper, it seemed poorly conceived. Open-topped turret, thin armor barely thicker than a Sherman's, and a 76mm gun that looked adequate but not exceptional. Panther commanders read these reports and felt reassured. This was not a machine that could challenge them in a fair fight. But the Americans had never intended to fight fair. The M10 Wolverine was built on a single revolutionary principle: mobility trumps armor. While German engineers obsessed over increasing plate thickness and frontal protection, American designers stripped away everything that wasn't essential to one mission: getting into position fast, striking hard, and disappearing before the enemy could respond. What the Germans failed to grasp until it was too late was that the M10's modest top speed of 30 miles per hour on roads masked its real advantage. On rough terrain, across fields, through wooded areas where Panthers crawled cautiously, the Wolverine maintained speeds that seemed physically impossible for a tracked vehicle mounting a 3-inch gun. The hedgerow country of Normandy became the Wolverine's proving ground. German Panther crews, already unnerved by bazooka teams hiding in every hedge, soon discovered an even more unsettling threat. As they advanced down narrow lanes, confident that their frontal armor could shrug off most American weapons, they began to notice a disturbing pattern. Panthers would engage American Shermans at long range, scoring quick kills and preparing to advance. Then, seemingly from nowhere, M10s would appear on their flanks, not slowly rolling into position like traditional tank destroyers, but racing across open fields at speeds that defied everything German tankers understood about tracked vehicles under combat conditions. One Panther commander later described his first encounter with circling Wolverines. "We destroyed 2 Shermans in rapid succession. We were preparing to push forward when our radio operator screamed about movement on our right flank. Before I could traverse the turret, a shell struck our side armor. The impact threw me against the turret wall. When I looked through the periscope, I saw an American tank destroyer already racing away at impossible speed. We tried to pursue, but it vanished into a tree line before we could bring our gun to bear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The geometry of this new warfare was devastating. A Panther's frontal armor could resist most Allied weapons, but its side armor was far more vulnerable. The Germans had designed their tanks expecting frontal duels across open ground. The M10 crews exploited this assumption ruthlessly. American tank destroyer doctrine emphasized what they called the shoot-and-scoot tactic, but the M10 crews developed it into something approaching an art form. Intelligence reports and veteran accounts suggest a typical ambush sequence lasted barely 90 seconds from first movement to disappearance. The choreography was brutal in its efficiency. Seconds 0 to 20. Wolverines in concealed positions wait as Panthers advance. Crews have already ranged targets, calculated lead angles, and identified escape routes. Seconds 20 to 25. First M10 breaks cover, accelerating to maximum speed, while closing the angle to the Panther's vulnerable flank or rear quarter. Seconds 25 to 30. First shot fired at range of 400 to 800 meters, typically aimed at the side armor behind the turret ring or at the engine deck. Seconds 30 to 40. If the first Wolverine's shot penetrates, the Panther is mission killed or burning. If not, the second and third M10s in the team are already firing from different angles, creating a crossfire that the Panther cannot effectively respond to. Seconds 40 to 60. Surviving crew members bail out or the Panther attempts to traverse its turret, but the M10's open-topped design allows for faster crew communication and target acquisition. Additional shots are fired as the Wolverines maintain motion. Seconds, 60 to 90. M10s accelerate away. Using pre-scouted routes through terrain, the heavier Panthers cannot effectively pursue through. By the time German infantry support arrives or other tanks can orient on the threat, the Wolverines have vanished. German after-action reports from Normandy and France repeatedly describe this sequence with a tone of frustrated disbelief. Tank commanders trained in the methodical warfare of the Eastern Front could not adapt to enemies that refused to stand and fight, that turned every engagement into a high-speed ambush. What truly devastated Panther crews was not the physical destruction, though that was severe enough, but the psychological impact of being consistently outmaneuvered by supposedly inferior machines. German tankers had built their identity on technical superiority. The Panther was a masterpiece of engineering, a tank that could dominate any opponent in a direct confrontation. But the M10 Wolverines never gave them that confrontation. Instead, they reduced the proud Panther crews to targets in a shooting gallery, unable to leverage their advantages because the Americans simply refused to engage on German terms. Veterans later described a growing paranoia that infected entire units. Every advance became an ordeal of constant vigilance, with commanders obsessively scanning flanks and rear approaches. The smooth coordination that had characterized German armored operations began to break down as Panther commanders became increasingly hesitant to push forward without extensive reconnaissance and flank security. One particularly revealing diary entry from a Panther platoon leader in France, August 1944, reads, "We spotted 3 Shermans at 1,200 meters, easy kills, but I ordered the platoon to hold position. My gunner protested we could have destroyed them all. But I have learned. The Shermans are bait. Somewhere, hidden in the trees or behind that ridge, the tank destroyers are waiting. If we advance, they will circle us like wolves. Better to let the Shermans escape than to lose another Panther to those damned Wolverines." This was the true victory of the M10 doctrine. It had turned Germany's finest tank crews into fearful, reactive forces that hesitated at critical moments. The M10's devastating flanking capability was not accidental. It emerged from careful engineering choices that prioritized mobility and firepower over survivability. The Wolverine's suspension system, adapted from the M4 Sherman, was over-engineered for its lighter weight. This gave it superior cross-country performance and allowed it to maintain higher speeds over rough terrain than its specifications suggested. The open-topped turret, which German crews initially saw as a fatal weakness, actually enabled faster turret traverse and superior situational awareness. American crews could spot threats and acquire targets more quickly than their German counterparts buttoned up inside fully enclosed turrets. The 76mm M7 gun, while not as powerful as the Panther's 75mm Cab UK-42, was more than adequate when firing at side armor from flanking positions. At ranges under 1,000 meters, the typical distance for these ambushes, it could reliably penetrate 80 to 100 millimeters of armor plate, more than sufficient to kill a Panther, whose side armor measured only 40-50 millimeters in most locations. Perhaps most importantly, the M10's relatively light weight of 29 tons, compared to the Panther's 45 tons, meant it could cross terrain the German tank simply could not. Bridges that collapsed under Panthers held for Wolverines. Fields that bogged down the heavier German tanks were navigable for the Americans. This expanded the geometric possibilities of the battlefield in ways that consistently surprised German commanders. The M10's success against Panthers represented more than just one weapon system defeating another. It signaled a fundamental shift in armored warfare philosophy that the Germans, locked into their doctrine of heavy tanks and frontal engagements, failed to anticipate. American tank destroyer doctrine was built around the principle that killing enemy armor was a specialized task, requiring specialized equipment and tactics. While German panzers were expected to perform multiple roles: infantry support, breakthrough operations, and anti-tank warfare, the M10 had a single mission: find enemy tanks and destroy them using speed and position, not thick armor. This specialization proved devastatingly effective. M10 battalions developed tactics that emphasized reconnaissance, ambush positioning, and rapid redeployment. They worked closely with infantry and artillery to create what modern military theorists would call a system of systems approach. Shermans would fix German armor in place, artillery would suppress infantry support, and then the Wolverines would strike from unexpected angles at high speed. German commanders, trained to think in terms of tank versus tank duels and breakthrough operations, struggled to counter this integrated approach. Their tactical doctrine had no good answer to an enemy that refused direct engagement and instead treated every encounter as an opportunity for ambush. By the autumn of 1944, German loss reports began showing a disturbing pattern. Panthers, engaged by M10 tank destroyer battalions, suffered catastrophic loss rates, often losing 60–70% of engaged vehicles when caught in ambushes. Even more telling, the vast majority of these losses showed side or rear penetrations, confirming that German crews were being consistently outmaneuvered. American after-action reports from the same period show M10 battalions achieving kill ratios of 4-to-1 or higher against Panther's 4 German tanks destroyed for every Wolverine lost. In ambush scenarios where M10s achieved complete surprise, these ratios sometimes reached 8-to-1 or 10-to-1. The logistical impact was crippling. Germany could not replace Panthers at anything approaching the rate they were being destroyed. Each loss represented not just a destroyed tank but lost crew experience, decreased unit cohesion, and a blow to morale that rippled through entire divisions. For the men inside Panthers, the arrival of M10 battalions in their sector became an omen of disaster. Veteran crews who had survived the Eastern Front spoke privately of preferring the straightforward brutality of combat against Soviet armor to the nerve-shredding uncertainty of facing American tank destroyers. One particularly haunting account comes from a Panther driver who survived 3 separate M10 ambushes in France. The first time, I didn't understand what was happening. One moment we were advancing in formation, confident and strong. The next, my commander was screaming and flames were erupting from the tank beside us. I saw the American machine racing away, impossibly fast, already disappearing before our guns could track it. The second time, we were ready. We had infantry screening our flanks, reconnaissance forward, and we moved cautiously. It didn't matter. They hit us from behind, from a direction we thought was secure. 3 tanks burning in less than a minute. The third time, I was shaking before we even started moving. Every shadow looked like a tank destroyer. Every sound could be the engine of a Wolverine racing toward our flank. When they finally hit us, and they always did, I was almost relieved. The waiting, the knowing they were out there hunting us, was worse than the actual attack. This psychological deterioration affected combat effectiveness in measurable ways. German units began to advance more slowly, to halt at every suspected ambush site, to demand reinforcements for operations that earlier in the war they would have undertaken without hesitation. The initiative that had characterized German armored operations in 1940 and 1941 had evaporated, replaced by a defensive mentality focused on survival rather than victory. When the war ended, German tank commanders who had faced M10 Wolverines consistently rated them as one of the most dangerous threats they had encountered, not because the M10 was superior in a direct engagement, but because it refused to fight directly. In post-war interviews and memoirs, Panther crews described the M10 with a mixture of respect and resentment. They acknowledged its effectiveness while bristling at the unfair tactics American crews employed. This reaction itself reveals the depth of the psychological impact. The Germans had been outthought, not just outfought. The M10 Wolverine demonstrated that in modern warfare, mobility and tactical flexibility could overcome raw firepower and armor protection. This lesson would shape NATO tank doctrine throughout the Cold War, influencing the design of everything from the M18 Hellcat to the Leopard 1 to the Striker MGS. But perhaps the M10's greatest achievement was simpler and more devastating. It taught the proud Panther crews to fear the flanks, to hesitate, to doubt. It transformed Germany's most sophisticated tank from a symbol of superiority into a target for hunters who struck at 50 miles per hour and vanished before their prey could even turn to fight. In 90 seconds or less, the Wolverines could destroy a panther. But the psychological damage, the constant fear, the eroded confidence, the tactical paralysis that lasted far longer than 90 seconds. It lasted for the rest of the war, and for many survivors, the rest of their lives. As the Allied advance pushed deeper into France and approached the German border, M10 crews refined their tactics to an almost surgical precision. What had begun as opportunistic flanking maneuvers in Normandy evolved into a sophisticated system of mobile warfare that exploited every weakness in German armored doctrine. American tank destroyer battalions began operating in what they called hunter-killer teams, typically 3 to 5 Wolverines working in coordinated patterns. While one M10 drew German attention with probing movements, the others positioned themselves along likely retreat routes or in defilade positions that covered multiple approach angles. The Germans called this tactic the wolf pack, and they feared it with good reason. The mathematics of these engagements were brutal. A Panther's turret traverse speed was approximately 360 degrees in 60 seconds under ideal conditions. In combat, with a stressed crew and mechanical resistance from battle damage, this slowed considerably. The M10's open-topped turret allowed crews to physically rotate and spot targets faster, giving them a crucial advantage in the split-second decisions that determined survival. More devastating still was the M10's acceleration. From a concealed position, a Wolverine could reach 30 miles per hour in under 15 seconds on firm ground. Panthers, with their heavier weight and more complex transmission, needed nearly twice that time. In the geometry of an ambush, those extra seconds meant the difference between a successful flanking shot and a missed opportunity. German crews learned to dread specific terrain features. Parallel tree lines became death traps, allowing M10s to race along covered approaches while Panthers were forced into open killing zones. Rolling hills that provided excellent hull-down positions for defensive operations became avenues for Wolverine attacks from multiple angles. Village outskirts, with their network of farm roads and field paths, gave American crews infinite options for approach and escape. One Panther commander from the 2nd Panzer Division described the hopelessness of these tactical situations. "We knew they were out there. We could sometimes hear their engines, see dust from their movement. But by the time we identified their position and began to orient our guns, they had already moved. It was like fighting smoke, and when they finally struck, it was always from the direction we had just checked, the angle we thought was secure." The autumn campaign in Lorraine demonstrated the M10's devastating effectiveness on a strategic scale. As Patton's Third Army pushed toward the German border, Panther battalions attempted to establish defensive lines that would bleed the American advance. On paper, the plan was sound: use the superior range and frontal armor of the Panthers to create killing zones that would force the Americans into costly frontal assaults. The M10 battalions shattered this plan within days. Rather than engaging German defensive positions head-on, American reconnaissance elements identified Panther positions and fed coordinates to mobile tank destroyer teams. The Wolverines would then execute what became known as reconnaissance by fire, high-speed approaches to multiple positions, firing at long range to force German tanks to reveal their exact locations by returning fire or repositioning. Once German positions were confirmed, the real assault began. M10s would approach from multiple directions simultaneously, using terrain and speed to close within effective range before Panthers could effectively respond. The results were catastrophic for German armor. In a 2-week period in November 1944, German records show that nearly 60% of Panther losses in the Lorraine sector came from flank or rear hits, with American tank destroyers credited for the majority of kills. What made these losses particularly devastating was that many occurred during what should have been favorable tactical situations for the Germans. Panthers in prepared defensive positions, with infantry support and clear fields of fire, were being systematically destroyed by Wolverines that refused to enter their kill zones. Instead, the M10s circled around strong points, struck from unexpected angles, and disappeared before German forces could coordinate effective responses. A staff officer from Panzer Lehr Division wrote in his diary, "We have superior tanks, superior guns, superior training, and yet we are being destroyed piecemeal by American machines that should not be able to challenge us. The problem is not the quality of their equipment, it is that they refuse to fight the way we expect. Every engagement becomes a chase where we are somehow always the prey, never the hunter." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The M10's flanking dominance was not just tactical brilliance, it was enabled by mechanical advantages that German engineers had not anticipated. The Wolverine's Ford GAA V8 engine, the same power plant used in later Sherman variants, produced 450 horsepower in a vehicle weighing only 29 tons. This gave it a power-to-weight ratio of 15.5 horsepower per ton. By comparison, the Panther's Maybach HL 230 produced 700 horsepower, but had to move 45 tons of tank, yielding only 15.5 horsepower per ton. On paper, the ratios were identical. In practice, the M10's lighter weight meant better acceleration, tighter turning radius, and superior performance on soft ground, where weight distribution became critical. The Wolverine's track ground pressure was also significantly lower, around 10.5 pounds per square inches, compared to the Panther's 12.8 pounds per square inches. This seemingly minor difference had major tactical implications. Fields that bogged down Panthers remained navigable for M10s. Stream crossings that required Panthers to seek bridges could be forded by Wolverines. Every restriction on Panther mobility became an opportunity for M10 crews to exploit. German crews also underestimated the tactical value of the M10's open-topped turret. While this design choice left crews vulnerable to artillery airbursts and infantry fire from elevated positions, it provided massive advantages in tank versus tank combat. Crew members could observe in all directions, without relying entirely on periscopes. Communication between crew positions was faster and clearer. Most critically, crews could bail out in seconds if their vehicle was hit, leading to higher survival rates that preserved experienced crews for future engagements. A captured German intelligence report from early 1945 acknowledged these advantages with grudging respect. The American M10 is not a superior tank destroyer by conventional measures. Its armor is inadequate, its gun merely satisfactory, but its design philosophy, prioritizing speed and crew survivability over protection, has proven devastatingly effective against our heavier machines. We have designed tanks to win battles. The Americans have designed a vehicle to hunt tanks. And in that specific mission, we must concede they have succeeded. As Allied forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, the psychological burden on Panther crews reached its breaking point. Now fighting on their own soil, with their families and homes in the path of the advance, German tankers faced American forces that had perfected their tank-killing tactics through months of brutal experience. M10 battalions, now veterans of campaigns from Normandy to the Rhine, operated with almost casual efficiency. They knew exactly how German crews would react to specific situations, where Panthers would position themselves, which routes they would use for retreat. The hunters had learned every habit of their prey. The Battle of the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945 provided a final demonstration of M10 dominance. German armoured units, trapped and attempting to break out, ran straight into prepared positions where American tank destroyers waited with patience and precision. Wolverines positioned at crossroads and choke points destroyed Panthers with mechanical regularity, often achieving first-shot kills at ranges under 500 meters, where the 76mm gun was absolutely lethal against side armor. Survivors from these final battles described a sense of inevitability that had replaced earlier fears. One Panther loader, captured after his third tank was destroyed by an M10, told interrogators, "We stopped trying to fight them. When we saw the dust of their approach or heard their engines, we knew it was over." Some crews abandoned their Panthers rather than wait for the attack. Better to survive as prisoners than burn alive in a tank that couldn't run fast enough or turn quick enough to save us. This collapse of will was perhaps the M10's greatest victory. The psychological dominance established through hundreds of 90-second kills had transformed German tankers from confident warriors into defeated men who no longer believed their machines could protect them. The myth of Panther superiority had been demolished not through superior technology, but through superior tactics executed at speeds German doctrine could not counter. When the war ended in May 1945, surviving Panther crews carried memories that would haunt them for decades. Not memories of glorious tank duels or heroic last stands, but of being hunted across France and Germany by American machines that struck like lightning and vanished like ghosts. The M10 Wolverine had rewritten the rules of armoured warfare, and the Germans had paid the tuition in blood, steel, and shattered confidence. The M10's success against Panthers was not merely a story of one weapon system defeating another. It represented a fundamental philosophical divide in how Americans and Germans conceptualized armoured warfare. This divide would shape military thinking for generations to come. German tank doctrine, inherited from the early Blitzkrieg victories, emphasized the tank as a decisive weapon that could break through enemy lines and exploit deep into the rear. Tanks were expected to be multi-role platforms. They would fight other tanks, support infantry, and serve as mobile artillery. This philosophy led to increasingly heavy, complex, and expensive machines like the Panther, which attempted to excel at every possible mission. American doctrine took a radically different approach. The tank destroyer concept, embodied by the M10, was built on specialization and economy of force. Rather than creating expensive machines that did everything adequately, the Americans designed focused weapons that did one thing superbly: killing enemy tanks. Everything else, armor protection, crew comfort, versatility, was secondary to mobility and firepower. This philosophical difference manifested in every engagement. Panther crews expected combat to unfold in predictable patterns: advance, identify enemy armor, engage at range using superior optics and guns, dominate the field. The M10 crews discarded these conventions entirely. They avoided frontal engagements, refused to trade shots at range, and transformed every battle into a three-dimensional chess game where position mattered more than armor thickness. Post-war analysis by both American and German military theorists identified the M10's doctrine as a revolutionary development. Colonel Hans von Luck, a veteran German armoured commander, wrote in his memoirs, "We were fighting the last war with the next war's technology. The Americans were fighting the next war with adequate technology. Their tank destroyers did not need to be invincible, they only needed to be fast enough to hit us where we were vulnerable. We finally understood this, but far too late." The US Army's own post-war studies confirmed the effectiveness of this approach. M10 battalions had achieved their primary objective, destroying enemy armor at favorable loss ratios. But more significantly, they had fundamentally altered German tactical behavior, forcing Panthers to fight defensively and surrender the initiative that had been Germany's greatest weapon in the early war years. The men who crewed M10 Wolverines were not typical tankers. They were selected and trained for a specific mission profile that emphasized aggression, independent thinking, and tactical flexibility, far beyond what was expected of conventional tank crews. American tank destroyer training doctrine stressed what they called offensive defense, a seemingly contradictory term that captured the essence of M10 tactics. Crews were taught to think like hunters rather than soldiers. They studied terrain analysis with the intensity of naturalists, learning to identify covered approaches, defilade positions, and escape routes. They practiced rapid displacement drills until they could vacate a firing position and reach cover in under 60 seconds. Most critically, M10 crews trained extensively in high-speed gunnery. Unlike conventional tank training that emphasized accuracy from stationary positions, Wolverine gunners learned to engage targets while their vehicle was in motion at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. This required exceptional skill, calculating lead angles while bouncing across rough terrain, compensating for the vehicle's movement, and firing in the brief moments when the gun was aligned with a target's vulnerable points. German crews, by contrast, were trained in methodical positional warfare. Panther training emphasized precision gunnery at long range from prepared positions. Crews practiced coordinated movements in formation, supporting infantry advances and maintaining defensive lines. This training served them well on the Eastern Front against Soviet mass attacks, but left them completely unprepared for American tank destroyers that refused to fight conventionally. The psychological preparation was equally important. M10 crews were taught to embrace risk-taking in ways that would have been considered reckless in conventional tank doctrine. They were encouraged to close to ranges under 500 meters, where their 76mm guns were most effective, even though this meant exposing themselves to return fire. They practiced what instructors called violent maneuver, sudden accelerations, sharp turns, and aggressive positioning that kept enemy gunners off balance. One M10 commander from the 3rd Tank Destroyer Battalion explained the mindset. "We weren't trying to survive by being tough. We survived by being impossible to hit. Speed, surprise, and violence of action, those were our armor. We'd rather take our chances racing at 40 miles per hour across open ground than sitting still in a tank with 3 inches of steel plate. Movement meant life. Standing still meant death." This training philosophy produced crews who were, by all accounts, among the most aggressive and skillful in the American Army. When these men encountered Panthers in combat, they brought not just superior tactics, but a completely different warrior mindset, one focused on the hunt rather than the duel. Behind every successful M10 ambush was an intelligence apparatus that gave American crews a decisive advantage. While German forces increasingly operated in an information vacuum, Allied air superiority had blinded their reconnaissance. M10 battalions benefited from near-perfect battlefield awareness. American intelligence officers developed extensive profiles of German armored units, tracking their movements, identifying commanders by name, and predicting their tactical responses with remarkable accuracy. Captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and signals. Intelligence provided a continuous stream of information about Panther deployments, mechanical readiness, and intended operations. This intelligence was rapidly disseminated to M10 crews through forward observers and liaison officers embedded with reconnaissance units. By late 1944, it was not uncommon for Wolverine commanders to receive updates on German tank positions within 15 to 20 minutes of their identification. This near-real-time intelligence allowed M10 battalions to position themselves along German routes of advance or retreat before the Panthers even began moving. The Germans, meanwhile, operated with fragmentary and often outdated information about American tank destroyer deployments. They knew M10s were in theater, but rarely had accurate counts, locations, or operational patterns. This information asymmetry meant that German commanders were constantly reacting to threats they couldn't see, while American crews hunted with precise knowledge of their prey's location and intentions. Air reconnaissance played a crucial role. American spotter planes could identify German armor concentrations and radio coordinates directly to tank destroyer battalions. In some cases, M10 crews received warnings of approaching Panthers 20 to 30 minutes before visual contact, allowing them to prepare ambush positions with meticulous care. German Panthers, denied similar air support after 1943, advanced blind into killing zones prepared by enemies who knew exactly where they were and where they were going. A captured German operations officer, interrogated in early 1945, expressed his frustration. "We were fighting shadows who seemed to know our every move. Our Panthers would advance toward what we believed was an open route, only to be ambushed by American tank destroyers already in position. It was as if they could read our orders before we issued them. How do you fight an enemy who knows where you are but remains invisible until they strike?" The answer, of course, was that the Americans had systematically dismantled the German intelligence apparatus while building their own into a precision instrument. The M10's tactical success was built on this foundation of information superiority as much as on mechanical speed. For all the tactical sophistication and mechanical advantages, the war inside and around M10 Wolverines was brutal, terrifying, and often short. American tank destroyer crews suffered casualty rates that rivaled infantry units in intense combat. The open-topped turret that provided such tactical advantages also meant vulnerability to artillery, mortars, and even small arms fire from elevated positions. Crew members recalled the constant tension of operating in a vehicle with minimal protection. Every advance toward German lines meant exposure to a hurricane of fire. Shell, fragments, bullets, and shrapnel could kill or maim crews, even when the vehicle itself remained functional. The psychological burden of knowing that only speed and maneuver stood between you and death weighed heavily on even the most experienced crews. Yet remarkably, M10 crews developed an almost fatalistic confidence in their tactics. They had seen their methods work repeatedly, had witnessed Panthers burning after successful ambushes, had raced away from German positions with shells exploding harmlessly behind them. This success bred a warrior culture that celebrated aggression and cunning over caution. The casualties, when they came, were often catastrophic. A direct hit from a Panther's 75mm gun would penetrate an M10's thin armor effortlessly, typically igniting ammunition and fuel in a massive explosion. Crews rarely survived such hits, but the statistical reality was that M10s killed Panthers at rates of 4 or 5 to 1, brutal mathematics that meant American crews could accept losses and still accomplish their mission. One M10 gunner who survived the war from Normandy to Germany described the paradox. "We knew we were in death traps if the Germans caught us, but we also knew they almost never caught us. We were faster, we were smarter, and we had better information." The guys who died, most of them made mistakes, got careless, or just had terrible luck. If you followed doctrine, stayed aggressive, and kept moving, your odds were actually pretty good. Better than the poor bastards in the Panthers. Anyway, this mindset, accepting vulnerability while maintaining confidence through superior tactics, was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the M10 crew's experience. They had internalized a brutal truth. In modern armored warfare, mobility and position mattered more than protection. The Germans never fully accepted this truth, and it cost them everything. When the M10 Wolverine was gradually phased out after the war, replaced by more heavily armored tank destroyers, and eventually by main battle tanks that combined firepower, protection, and mobility, its tactical lessons remained embedded in military doctrine worldwide. The concept of using speed to achieve positional advantage, of refusing to fight on the enemy's terms, of specialization over versatility. These principles shaped the next generation of armored vehicle design. The Soviet ASU-85 airborne tank destroyer, the Swedish S-tank, and even the German Leopard 1 all embodied aspects of the M10's philosophy, that mobility could substitute for armor if employed with skill and aggression. Perhaps more importantly, the M10's success against the Panther destroyed forever the myth that heavier, more complex tanks were inherently superior. The post-war arms race produced increasingly sophisticated machines, but military planners never again forgot that the best tank was not always the one with the thickest armor or longest gun. It was the one that could get into position to kill the enemy before the enemy could respond. For the German Panther crews who survived the war, the M10 remained a source of bitter memories and reluctant respect. In reunions and memoirs produced decades later, veterans still spoke of the Wolverines with a mixture of fear and admiration. They had been beaten not by superior technology, but by superior thinking by an enemy that refused to fight the war they had trained for, and instead created a new form of warfare built on speed, surprise, and the ruthless exploitation of mechanical advantage. The M10 Wolverine proved that, in war, as in nature, the fastest hunters often survive while the mightiest prey fall, and for 90 seconds at a time, across the fields of France and the forests of Germany, those Wolverines hunted Panthers to the edge of extinction. Decades after the last shots were fired, the men who had faced each other across the killing fields of Western Europe gathered occasionally at veteran reunions and military history conferences. In these twilight meetings, former Panther crews and M10 commanders shared stories with a frankness impossible during the war itself. A recurring theme emerged from these conversations. The Panther crews had never truly understood what they were facing until it was too late. They had entered combat believing their superior engineering would prevail. They left those battles, if they left at all, knowing that the war had evolved beyond their doctrine, beyond their training, beyond their magnificent machines. One former Panther commander, meeting an M10 crew at a 1972nd reunion in Belgium, finally asked the question that had haunted him for 30 years. "How did you know where we would be? Every time we moved, you were already waiting." The American, now grey-haired and wearing bifocals, smiled sadly. "We didn't need to know where you'd be, we just needed to be faster than you, and we always were." That simple exchange captured the entire story. The Panther was a masterpiece designed to win yesterday's war. The M10 was an adequate machine designed to win tomorrow's. In those 90-second engagements repeated across 1,000 battlefields, tomorrow consistently defeated yesterday. The numbers tell part of the story. Thousands of Panthers destroyed, hundreds of M10 crews who never came home, entire armoured divisions ground to scrap metal in the forests and fields of Europe. But the deeper truth lives in the memories of the men who were there, the German crews who learned to fear every shadow and hedge, and the American crews who learned that speed and cunning could topple giants. The M10 Wolverine was retired, scrapped, and largely forgotten by history in favour of more glamorous weapons. But for the men who crewed Panthers in 1944 and 1945, the sound of that Ford GAA engine racing at full throttle, the sudden appearance of that angular silhouette where no enemy should have been, the devastating crack of a 76mm gun fired at point-blank range into vulnerable side armour, those memories never faded. They had been hunted at 50 miles per hour, and in 90 seconds, everything they believed about armoured warfare had been shattered as completely as their tanks,